a parade to mark the Queen's official birthday. An event taking place in London and many parts of the world. But this is Dar es Salaam.
The roots of the King's African Rifles go right back into Africa's history. There have always been intertribal clashes, either for the acquisition of cattle, goats or wives, or to train and enhance the fighting reputation of the young warriors. In the case of those tribes able to muster thousands of warriors for making forays into neighboring territory and to cow their neighbors, just as the Maasai did to the Kikuyu. But the real curse to descend upon the land of Africa was the fearful and dreaded slave trade. We shall never know how many millions of Africans perished in this horrible trade, but as many died in the bush as were shipped away by the Arab slave traders from the east coast of Africa. It was not until 1859 that this fearsome trade was exposed by the explorer Dr. David Livingstone. He returned to Britain. He was able to expose the whole thing to the world. And as a consequence, the missionaries set off to Africa to try to stop this atrocious practice. By the mid-1880s, this horrible trade had reached its climax, and thousands of Africans were being slaughtered by the Arab slave trader Mlozi. The missionaries had no weaponry themselves, and so they reacted by forming local militia from the tribesmen and to try to stand and fight against it. Their plight was relieved by the arrival of British Army officer Captain Lugard. The response of the Portuguese to this professional military intervention was to attack and seize an area in the Nyassa territory. The British government reacted by declaring the area a protectorate, and they sent 150 soldiers over from India. And with that as a basis, they formed 2 battalions of the British Central Rifles under a Captain Mogwai. In the following years, numerous campaigns were carried out. The slave trade was successfully suppressed and peace was established. And such was the success of these operations that foreign service followed in Mauritius and Somaliland, and under Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Cobb, VC, in the West Coast in Ghana and Gambia. Finally, under the command of Brigadier General William Manning, on the 1st of January 1902, the King's African Rifles was officially formed.
East Africa, pearl of the African continent. An area that stretches from the Indian Ocean in the east to the Great Lakes of the Rift Valley in the west, and southwards for 3,000 miles from the mountains of Ethiopia and the hot, low-lying deserts of coastal Somalia, through Kenya and the rolling uplands of Uganda, Tanganyika, Nyasaland, and on to northern and southern Rhodesia, now Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. 30 years after the end of British colonial administration in Africa is perhaps a good moment to look back at part of the heritage that Britain left behind. It is to some of the events and to the life and times that this story offers a glimpse of a culture which lasted for little more than 50 years. Nevertheless, it epitomized the remarkable contribution made by the British to an area which had not even been properly explored until the end of the last century. And for those who were present when the King's African Rifles marched out of Burma through the night at the end of 1944, after completion of the last patrols of the 11th East African Division, they will recall how the Askari sang almost continuously. The jungle roads were dusty, and the rains had gone. The Japanese were far away, and Christmas was just across the Chilwyn. Make ready for the journey to Funga Safari. And just how does the young African respond to the call of arms? What sets him on the path to becoming a trained askari ready to meet whatever challenge? African life is steeped in tribal tradition. Recruitment into the close-knit multi-tribal community of a regiment calls for considerable experience by training officers. Recruiting safaris would be regularly sent out into different regions in the heartland of Africa. Even before the recruiting party's arrival at the scheduled destination, a large gathering would build up. Such displays would be the event of the year for the local population. News of an intended visit by the KAR would have reached not only the town, but the country for miles around. The African drums, the original Bush telegraph, would have heralded the KAR's arrival well ahead of the published notice by the district commissioner. The area would be thronged with crowds of Africans. The young men, hopeful for selection, quickly line up. Shortly after the full heat of day would be the time for the start of the displays. There would be an official welcome for the KAR from the tribal chiefs, accompanied by their women suitably dressed for the special occasion. The atmosphere would be one of great expectation, each person recalling a previous visit or tales of old passed down by the Waze in their village. Having set up camp in the morning, the afternoon may have staged a football match against the local side, something guaranteed to bring out high emotion. Later, at dusk, the corps of drums will beat retreat, and the remainder of the evening will be spent socializing. Long before the appointed time for the displays to commence, an excited expectation is built up in the crowd. The enthusiasm is almost tangible. Everything is greeted with amazement. The setting up and firing of 3-inch mortars get the proceedings underway. They are noisy, marvelous, and result in smoke of all colors. The remarkable display of drill is greeted with much appreciation. Most of the people in the crowd will never have witnessed anything like it before. This was a time well before television. Although some will have received education in mission schools, many will have never even needed to wear a pair of shoes. When it comes to fieldcraft, the African has something to teach the European. Most Africans up country will have had a lifetime of experience following game and defending their herds against leopard and lion. As a tracker, the askari is the finest in the world and rated better than even the famous Borneo Igbo tribe. The crowd will have no difficulty in understanding and identifying the fire and movement routine from the British Army Fieldcraft Manual. After the performance, there is no shortage of applicants who eagerly rush forward. The opportunity of service with the KAR is highly prized, and askari are held in great respect in their home villages. Selection of possible recruits begins. There will be very many hopeful young men, all of magnificent physique. However, at every stage their numbers will be greatly narrowed down. General fitness and physique are only half the story. Eagerness is essential, but coordination is also of great importance. Not everyone gets the routine. Very quickly, the numbers are reduced to 3 or 4 dozen. But having got this far, the hopefuls rest, waiting for the next test. Finally, a select few are told to run a race across country. There may well be some athletes for the future Olympics in the making here. All leave together, and after a while, the first ones are seen straining every muscle to get in. Having crossed the line, breathless and gasping, they are liable to be told, "Get up and run it again." A few more drop out. With just a handful of possible recruits remaining, the regimental medical officer makes a careful final check for health and vision. Just 2 or 3 of the young men from this town will be picked as being suitable to sign on as recruits for training to become King's African Rifles askari. At the end of their service career, the majority will return mature and self-confident and become prominent men in their village. Just a few will go on to hold high rank and become figures known across the world. Having just put on a display for the town, the local people decide to put on a performance for their visitors, who, without doubt, are filled with a similar feeling of appreciation and wonder. Can there be anything more splendid than these dancers? Back at camp, the new recruits, totaling about 30, are issued with their kit. They will form the next training wing intake, and the next 6 months will be hard work for both them and their training officers and NCOs. When they finally pass out from the training wing and join one of the companies, each young man will have become one of the finest of his generation, just as their forebears were in 2 world wars.
The First World War was an African war as well as a European war. And Germany had important colonial possessions in Africa: German Southwest, German West Africa, and German East Africa, which was to become Tanganyika. And war broke out in all the German colonies in Africa at the very beginning. The Cameroon was quickly captured. German Southwest, which was very weakly defended, fell to the South Africans. But in German East Africa, the British fired a formidable opponent, a young officer of the local Schutztruppen called von Lettow-Vorbeck. And he raised an extremely effective guerrilla war against the British, and then the Belgians and Portuguese, who joined in from their adjoining colonies. In 1917 and 18, as he became more skilled and his askaris became more skilled, it became much more conventional in character, with pitched engagements, pitched battles, machine guns on both sides, artillery on the British side, and very heavy casualties, particularly among the British officers and the askaris. The fight of the King's African Rifles in German East Africa against von Lettow was its first serious military experience, which it discharged with great bravery and increasing skill. And by the end of the First World War, I think we may say that the King's African Rifles had become a full-scale military force. The King's African Rifles were not committed to war at the outset in 1939 as they had been in 1914, because Italy, which was to be the King's African Rifles' enemy, did not enter the war until 1940. So the threat that the Italians posed to British power in Egypt and British power in East Africa when they entered the war in June 1940 was a considerable one. And the Italians actually attacked. They captured British Somaliland. They attacked Kenya. They attacked the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. So this presented a challenge to the British which had to be met. From 1941 onwards, there were a series of British campaigns against the Italians in East Africa, mounted with British, with Indian, but also with African troops, with the King's African Rifles. British Somaliland was recaptured. The forays into the Sudan and Kenya were turned back. And then a great counteroffensive, both from north and south, was launched into Ethiopia to overthrow Italian imperial rule and restore the legitimate emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, to the throne. And this involved very big battles indeed. When the British met the Italians and their African soldiers, because the majority of their soldiers were Africans, the fighting was intense. And it was in one of these battles, Colito, that a non-commissioned officer of the King's African Rifles won the Victoria Cross. In 1942, the British were greatly concerned by the appearance of Japanese naval forces near Madagascar, the French colony off the southeast coast of Africa, which the British feared might fall into Japanese hands, or perhaps even be given by Vichy as a naval base to the Japanese. So it was decided to mount an amphibious operation against Madagascar, and in it the King's African Rifles took part, their first experience of amphibious operations, and the capture of Diego Suarez and the clearing of the island was a complete success and ended for good the danger that Japan might be able to extend its naval power into the Western Indian Ocean. By this stage of the war, the beginning of 1943, the King's African Rifles had greatly expanded from its original 4 battalions to 43 battalions, a 10-fold expansion, plus some smaller units. And this great reservoir of African manpower was a godsend to Churchill when he came to consider how to expand the war in Burma. Britain was desperately short of trained soldiers by the beginning of 1944, and the ability to transfer the 11th East African Division to the Far East was a great relief. Division's initial commitment was into the Arakan, the intensely difficult country on the northwest coast of Burma, opposite Bengal, at the head of the Bay of Bengal, country into which the British and the Indians had all penetrated, attempted to develop full-scale operations and been turned back. And so the Arakan was an extremely difficult baptism of fire for the King's African Rifles. Nevertheless, they succeeded in making inroads into the Arakan and to driving the Japanese back. Meanwhile, the great Japanese offensive, the so-called March on Delhi via Kohima and Imphal, had failed. After desperate fighting, the Japanese had turned back and were being pursued by Field Marshal, as he was to be, Field Marshal Slim and the 14th Army southwards towards the Chindwin and the central plain of Burma. And at this stage, the 11th East African Division was transferred to open up routes into the central Burmese plain and to secure crossings across the Chindwin, which it successfully did. The bridgeheads secured were at Sitong and Katewa. And after that, the King's African Rifles were transferred into the Kabul Valley, called by the Burmese the Valley of Death, one of the most difficult pieces of terrain in the whole of Burma, where they fought for 3 months with tremendous bravery and great loss of life, but secured important advantages over the Japanese. And at the end of their experience in the Kabul Valley, they were withdrawn for retraining and rest before proceeding to the next stage of operations in December 1944. There, as it happened, their share of the war ended because their next role was to invade Malaya. But by the time the plans were ready and they were fit and re-equipped and trained to go to Malaya, the war had ended through other means, by the explosion of the atomic bomb, as we know. So the King's African Rifles war concluded in Burma. They had played a major role in the war and made a tremendous contribution, a contribution said by Field Marshal Slim to be that of the best jungle fighting among the troops under his command. He paid high tribute to their skill and determination as jungle fighters.
Service as a young officer was a remarkably exhilarating experience. It was a process of learning, of adventure and excitement, and a very rewarding experience, mainly because the African is a natural soldier. Certainly the Askaris that we had from the various tribes from which we recruited, they were loyal, they were enthusiastic, they were smart, they had a wonderful sense of humour. Field firing of all sorts, very carefully controlled indeed, with all sorts of restrictions, and the same thing goes for ranges throughout Europe. But in Africa, there was no such restriction. You would notify the district officer in the area you wished to train in, maybe a week or a fortnight before, and he would get the word out around his district, and then you would go up and you would carry on field firing, live firing with your mortars, with your machine guns, with your rifles, and it was absolutely wonderful. I mean, there was very little restriction, and I cannot ever remember an accident, although certainly occasionally, despite the warnings that had gone out, you would see a tribesman striding across the danger area very arrogantly with his spear, not taking any notice of the bullets that were whistling around, and then you'd have to stop until he sort of disappeared out of the area. Well, the country, of course, was fascinating, apart from the wildlife, and I mean, everyone's seen films of the wonderful wildlife out there. The mere fact of travel was a great adventure. You'd set off, and we had the standard British Army Land Rover, which was not the most comfortable vehicle. It had pretty hard suspension, you know, there were cart springs at the back. And in the dry season, it was this all-pervading dust which got into everything. You know, it got into every nook and cranny, up your nose even, and in your ears and everywhere. And then you only had to have a bit of rain and the whole thing changed into a glutinous mud, and you'd be slipping and sliding along and up to your axles in mud, and very often it could take you a whole day to proceed about 5 miles. It was that sort of country. Very exciting. And we look at this picture now, you'll see this Land Rover actually going through this huge donga or nullah, which is the flood bed of a river. And these actually could be quite exciting because you could be in brilliant sunshine down on the plains and maybe 50 miles up country in the Aberdares or the headwaters of the Wassaneri River. You would have torrential rain falling, and you'd get great walls of water would come sweeping down these. We really had no discipline problems that I can remember. Certainly they were extremely rare. And I think the reason for this was that it was considered a great privilege for both Europeans and Africans to serve in the regiment. Certainly I remember there were always Africans waiting outside the barrack gate, hoping that they might be called upon to come in. And elsewhere in this film, I think you will see the recruiting procedure, and the competition to come in was enormously high. And I think that as a result of that, because they were enthusiastic and natural soldiers, we really didn't have discipline problems. Not the sort of petty things that you would get. They were well motivated, and they were always very well turned out. And I can well remember, on more than one occasion, you'd be driving your Land Rover across the bush, and it was quite obvious that one was a KAR patrol or a KAR party going somewhere. And way out in the distance, there'd be a figure would come running across the bush with his robes flapping around him and proudly hand up his service medals. And, you know, he was a member, I was a member of the KAR, and, you know, where do you come? And you had to stop, and of course it was a chance, and everybody got out, and we all had a drink, and they all chatted, and the Askari, who might be young chaps then, would talk to this chap, and he would be sort of telling them of the great deeds that he did when he was a member, particularly if he was a wartime member, of course, and they'd been to Burma and seen a lot of action, and of course the fighting up through Eritrea and Abyssinia. And, you know, this was a great thing, and it was all part of life, and you had time to stop. And it was very important for the young soldiers, the young Askari, because they realised the continuity of the regiment and the pride at which he came up and he would tell you all about it, and you ask him where he got this medal and who was his commanding officer and who he'd served with, and you'd have the whole story. And then after about half an hour or so, you'd all mount up and off you go. A system called Company Baraza or Company Shari, and that was quite an interesting system. The way it worked was that once a month, in our case, the company commander, without any of his officers or the senior NCOs, would gather the whole company together, and every Askari, if he had a problem, actually could raise it. It was a general discussion group, if you like. And this sounds a rather strange way of running an army, but it worked very well indeed, and it meant that we, as European officers, really got to know what the problems were. And the African Askari thought that they realized that they were able to produce their problems and their sharis, their troubles, and they would be listened to. Very often it enabled us to correct misinterpretations or impressions that were erroneous, and we could put that across. The African actually taught you to open your eyes and observe. I mean, not only simple things. We got to know how animals behave, the habits of birds, and this, of course, was terribly important on operations, because you learnt to understand actually how the terrorist would really operate it by looking at it through the African eyes. And I think this was a most interesting process. I mean, I can remember I learned so much from I had a shikari, or I suppose you might call him a gun bearer or a tracker, I think they were known as, really. And he taught me so much about how to track in the bush animals and the ways, the life of the bush. And it was an enormously valuable process of learning. And we learnt just as much from the Askari as he learnt from us. I, in fact, actually left on independence. But it was the fact that under Brigadier Miles Fitzallen Howard, who later became the Duke of Norfolk, he was the brigade commander, and it was under him that we actually worked towards independence, and the fact that we were able to hand over a going concern, even though we had very, very little time in which to do it.
Great emphasis would be given to physical recreational activities. Football, basketball and boxing tournaments played a major part in the development and establishing self-confidence of the young Askari. Combat comes naturally to these young Africans, who have been brought up to protect their home and herds of livestock from aggressors, both human and wild game. A herdsman, asked if he would sell his spear to a passing traveller, replied, "No, I need it against the lions." Support for Askari's benefit came in a variety of guises. The 5th Battalion in Nakuru, Kenya, was one of a number of battalions who took part in the Brigade Corps of Drums competition in 1959. Much to their delight, they were declared winners. It was decided that, in order to show their appreciation, an appeal was launched to re-equip the Corps. The response was immediate, and sufficient funds were raised from past and present officers, not to mention the Battalion Wives Club, to present 8 silver bugles to the winning Askari at a special parade. Guard duties are an essential part of every soldier's life. Askari always achieved near perfection in turnout. His highly polished boots, long puttees, starched khaki shorts and tunic, cummerbund and belt, complemented with a red fez, has always been a sight to see. Under the eye of the battalion adjutant, drill practice is carefully watched. These Askari will need more attention to detail before they achieve the satisfaction of the company sergeant major. From perfection on the parade ground comes the instinctive reaction to orders that in the heat of armed conflict could be the saving of his life. And just to show that perfection is possible, Brigade Commander Brigadier Birkbeck pays the 6th Battalion a visit. Preparation for the parade starts well ahead of schedule, but when the time comes, everyone puts the pride of the regiment into his step.
A sad fact today that post-war British generations know little of the contribution made by Britons and Africans in the whole of the East African side of Africa. In 2 world wars, they fought with great distinction, and many Britons made their life in East Africa for the good of the place as a whole. The Askari came from a warrior tribe. He had to prove he was a warrior, and he proved that by having to kill his first lion with a spear, only a spear, and from there he quite often joined the military and fought again, as I've said, with great distinction, particularly in Burma in the Second World War, where the 11th East African Division led the advance to the Chinwin and behaved and fought magnificently in probably what was the worst malarial area in the whole of the Burma campaign. The reputation of the East African was his resilience and toughness. Living in a large country with fairly sparse population, great distances to get from one place to another, the King's African Rifles were able to walk and march long distances. And in those days, particularly towards Ethiopia in the campaign there in the Second World War, armies weren't mechanized, and you walked, you marched. And again in Burma, there's no way you went by truck. You had to hack it, you had to walk, march. And the great distances that were marched by the troops. And the Africans had this reputation of being able to carry a very heavy load, either on their back or on their heads. And when you're thinking of food and ammunition and things like that, and go for great distances and come out smiling at the far end. They have a great sense of humor. Nowadays, I believe that the post-war generations of Britain have not been told the true story about the tremendous help that was given by the Empire and our colonies in both world wars. Good points about empire and the good things that empire achieved are not known by Britons today. I believe they should know that there were several generations of King's African Rifles before the Second World War and till they got independence, who gave outstanding service to the Crown and to Britain. And they've not necessarily been given the proper acclaim for being a great regiment with many battalions and with exemplary record in 2 world wars as good fighting men.
King's African Rifles officers, with a few exceptions, were regular serving officers who were given the opportunity of secondment into a different field of operation to serve for a period of just 3 years. This included many national service officers who remained with their KAR battalion for the whole of their service. The system ensured a constant renewal of fresh leadership qualities and a permanent injection of new initiative and enthusiasm into regimental duties. Without exception, those who returned after their tour of duty fully acknowledged that their time in Africa had been one of great enrichment to their lives. One regular event in the month was the Band Sunday. This was a fairly informal gathering held in the officers' mess. This was not purely a social occasion. Invitations were extended to the police, the colonial administrative offices, the public works department, and expatriate settlers from the countryside to build up relations between the different parties. These gatherings were memorable and always popular. The regimental band entertained the guests with a variety of music and never missed an opportunity of posing for the cameras, nor the chance of an ice-cold pint of Tusker. The annual battalion sports day was one of the highlights of the year. Later, at dusk, there would be an all-African ngoma, or festive dance. This took the form of roasting a carcass over an open fire, the meat being burnt on the outside and nearly raw on the inside, washed down with quantities of pombe, or beer. Officers were fully expected to savour tasty morsels, specially selected for them by the askari, and to be eaten in their fingers. On leaving the KAR, it was considered a privilege to pay for an animal for fattening, ready in time to be roasted at his farewell ngoma before returning to the UK. In the Kenya Highlands, away from the tsetse fly, it was possible to hold polo tournaments. Not quite Smith's Lawn, perhaps, but great entertainment for both riders and spectators. In 1957, a KAR contingent flew to the UK to perform in the Edinburgh Tattoo and the Royal Tournament. Quite the most colourful display was the warrior's dance. This was no pageant. All the tribal apparel, shields and spears were authentic, as were the ritual steps performed in the manner handed down in the tribal areas. Later, at the royal tournament, vivid memories still exist of the moment when the audience were almost lifted out of their seats by a sudden movement towards them by the warriors, with their spears. Amazingly calm, and not in the least overawed by their surroundings in the arena, the drill by the Askari was faultless. That young man, picked out in a recruiting safari not so long before, had come a long way and achieved a great deal. The Northern Frontier District of Kenya, NFD, as it was known, was a vast area of arid bush and semi-desert, over twice the size of England. This was administered by a handful of Europeans through the tribal police, TPs or Dubas, derived from Dub as or red turbans, who were all drawn from the Somali tribes. The camel is the most reliable means of patrolling this inhospitable land. The KAR provided additional support, and a rifle company was permanently stationed at Wajir. This was responsible for patrolling between the Ethiopian border to the north and the Somali border to the east, an area half the size of England, in addition to providing local defense of the RAF emergency strip for flights between Embakazi and Kormaksa in Aden. The fort at Wajir had a Beau Geste dreamlike quality. In these remote areas, the pace of life was much more relaxed. Social life for the European officers was centered at the Royal Wajir Yacht Club. The origin of a yacht club in the middle of a desert takes a little explaining. The members worked out that, notwithstanding they were in the middle of a desert, if they became a yacht club, they would be entitled to duty-free liquor. So the Wadi for camels received a somewhat pretentious status. When Edward, the Prince of Wales, on a visit to Kenya, heard the story, he liked it so much and said, "You'd better call it the Royal Wajir Yacht Club." During the 1950s, the regiment became closely involved in the Mau Mau emergency. The origin of the problem was complex and went as far back as 1895, when the country was declared a British protectorate. British settlers arrived in Kenya not only to administer and build an infrastructure, but also to farm the African soil. Up to the time before the British arrival, the Kikuyu tribe had been all but wiped out by disease and their neighbours, the Maasai. After the British stopped these intertribal wars, the Kikuyu prospered and were allocated tribal homelands in areas set aside in the highlands adjacent to the colonial settlers. However, resentment grew among a small number of Kikuyu in the White Highlands, especially the Aberdares, in the mistaken belief that the new Kenyans had taken land which had originally belonged to the Kikuyu tribe. A secret band of terrorists was formed, whose members were called the Mau Mau. Since the Europeanization of the land had been agreed with the tribal chiefs, it was the chiefs, together with a large number of loyal Kikuyu tribesmen, who suffered more at the hands of the Mau Mau terrorists than did the white farmers. Although the emergency only affected a small part of Kenya, it resulted in the King's African Rifles being fully mobilized to meet the threat. Various KAR battalions and the Kenya police were joined by additional British troops from the UK. The expatriates had formed their own Kenya regiment, led by their renowned Colonel Guy Campbell, who, out of immense courage, finally embarked on the highly dangerous course of infiltrating the Mau Mau gangs under disguise. It was all these forces working together which eventually brought the rebellion to an end. There can be few more glorious days in a regiment's life than the presentation and consecration of new colours to one of its battalions. This is even more so when the regiment's colonel-in-chief is Her Majesty the Queen. So it was, on one fine, hot and sparkling day in 1954, Queen Elizabeth II would arrive at King George VI's barracks, the King's African Rifles, in Jinja, Uganda, to present new colours to the 4th Battalion. Before the presentation of new colours, the old colours are paraded for the last time. A final resting place will be found for them in an appropriate cathedral or military place. The arrival of Her Majesty is really quite breathtaking. Gracefully, her open vehicle crosses the parade ground. Everyone rises to their feet. The royal standard is broken. With the commanding officer at its head, the regiment is reported ready for its colonel-in-chief to inspect. The Queen makes her way to the immaculate lines of Askari. These are the troops whose Askari forebears stamped out slavery, fought hard to protect their frontiers of the colonies and to maintain order amongst a turbulent population, and to defend the rights of their fellow Africans. They campaigned in West, Central and East Africa, Abyssinia, Sudan, Madagascar, Mauritius, Somaliland and Burma. The tradition of the colours in the British Army is steeped in history. The Queen's colour is the symbol of the sovereign, and the regimental colour is described as the soul of the regiment. The ceremony of trooping the colour has its origins in the earliest days of the British Army. Infantry regiments carried a regimental colour as a rallying point for the troops in the confusion of battle. It was the custom, therefore, before going into battle to troop the colour. This gave all ranks the opportunity of seeing and identifying their regimental colour. The colours are carried by a junior officer, the ensign, and it's his duty to defend them with his life. In the British Army's history, there are many famous episodes of astonishing bravery by the ensign to the colour. It is still today a junior officer of the battalion who carries the colour, and to be ensign of the colour is considered to be a great honour. Fourth side by side with KAR, Africa's sons and you, rankers approved in the affrays afar, officers brave and true, as one against the bold invader, one beneath the standard dear, Britain and black met the attack till they swept the border clear. At another time, on another parade ground, Royal Military Academy Sandhurst today, and another generation of the finest youth from many parts of the world is being prepared. The commander, 70 Infantry Brigade, the King's African Rifles, during the years leading up to independence in East Africa, Brigadier Miles Fitzalan Howard, now Major General the Duke of Norfolk, meets up with the adjutant of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, who, by happy coincidence, is nephew of one of his brigade staff officers from that time in the 1960s. Their conversation continues in the hall of Old College.
Kenya was going forward to become independent, and so when I arrived there were 150 white officers. When I left there were 100 black and 50 white officers. And we made up the Askari, the sergeant majors, the Effendis into officers. Some came back to Mons, but some were trained out there in Nairobi, because eventually the thing got so quick that we had to really hurry up and make them up quickly. And of course they were wonderful material. You see, the army way of selecting people was that a ordinary Askari got promoted up all the various ranks, and they were leaders automatically. I mean, Commissar Major Jackson Kameo commanded the Kenya Army for 4 or 5 years. Whether he's still commanding, I don't know. He must retire by now. But he was a sergeant major, and he became an officer, and became a full general by the end of it all, you know. As the colony was given independence, and all the district commissioners and the provincial commissioners and the governor were all gradually faded out, and the Africans took over. And by the same token, the black officers took over the KAR. You know, we not only enjoyed very much the adventure, but you felt very honoured to do it. And there was a great sort of trust in you to look after the men and then train them to take over their own army themselves.
what do you recall as one of the greatest stories of the King's African Rifles from the Second World War?
Well, I think the great stories were what they did in the Abyssinian War. I mean, they marched up from East Africa and captured Abyssinia from the Italians. And people who took part in that campaign were full of the stories and very proud to have done it.
As the wind of change, passing through Africa in the 1960s, heralded independence to these nations, so the various battalions of the King's African Rifles were transformed into the Malawi Army, the Kenya Army, the Tanzanian People's Defence Force, and the Ugandan People's Defence Force, all within the great British Commonwealth. But for those dedicated British officers who have drunk the waters of Africa, they will have it running through their veins for the rest of their lives.